Namaste. Today, I would like to talk about, or perhaps give a new perspective to a very famous debate, a controversy in Indian history. It is without a doubt one of the biggest controversies in Indian history, which, as we all know, is plagued with so many. But we can safely say it is the biggest controversy in world history. I mean, it is part of that controversy. The controversy, as far as the world is concerned, is about the origins of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the biggest language family on earth, which is spoken by close to 45% of humans today, a family of languages that is spread over all the continents except Antarctica, a family of languages that is recorded since at least the early second millennium BC, the family of languages that produce some of the most iconic and most powerful civilizations and cultures in history, including the Greeks, the Romans, the various Indian empires, the Persians, the Germans, the French, all of them, almost all the languages spoken in Europe, Iran, and northern India belong to this family of languages. So, we are all familiar with the famous Aryan Invasion theory and how, as a counter to it, many Indians propose an out of India theory. So, this debate between AIT and OIT has been raging on for decades. Both sides keep throwing arguments at each other. Both sides claim that their theory is solid, it's waterproof, and it's incontrovertible. But today I would like to look at the issue through another lens, using the tool of analogy. This is something I believe has not been done before. And so I am going to call it the Hyksos scenario and the Aryan Invasion theory. For this analogy, mind you, an analogy is accepted as a pramana in many Indian philosophies. For this analogy, I'll be taking the example of Egypt. Egypt would be a very fine analogy because Egypt, just like the Indus Valley civilization, is accepted as one of the three cradles of civilization. Why it would be an apt comparison is because they're both contemporaneous, for one. Their scripts are believed to have developed as early as the late 4th millennium BC. They both have monumental, have comparable achievements in culture and architecture. The Egyptians had monumental architecture, while the Harappans had incredible town planning and large cities. But population-wise, it would not be quite an ideal comparison because Harappans were far more populous, and the Indus civilization was much larger than Egypt, in fact larger than both Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. But nonetheless, as two of the cradles of civilization, comparing the history of both of them would be an ideal choice for this issue at hand. So, the Aryan Invasion theory, which at the moment has a large backing of consensus, or the Aryan migration theory as it has been toned down in recent years, it holds that a group of Sanskrit-speaking tribes invaded India, invaded South Asia during the late Harappan period. And the timeline offered for this is around the 16th century BCE. So now if we look at Egypt around the same time, around the 17th century BCE, Egypt faced a similar invasion. The invaders in Egypt were known as the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos invasion is very well recorded. It is known from literature. It is also known from archaeology. The Hyksos invaded in the 17th century BCE, and they put an end to the 13th dynasty of Egypt. And they're said to have formed the 15th dynasty. This period is also relevant because this is also the time that we find Sanskrit-speaking tribes appearing in Syria and Babylon. So this was a chaotic era in world history. A lot of movements, migrations, invasions, language diffusions, a lot of collapses of civilizations. A lot of stuff was happening in this time. But the difference between the proposed Aryan migration into India and the Hyksos invasion is that the Hyksos invasion of Egypt left so many traces both in archaeology as well as literature. In archaeology, we know that they brought significant technology into Egypt. They brought new traditions. They brought their new Semitic loanwords into the Egyptian language. They brought new weaponry. In fact, they are thought to have brought the chariot warfare into Egypt at this time. Of course, the Hyksos were thrown out in a few centuries, and the Egyptian rule returned. It's all fine so far. Now, let us imagine, for the sake of analogy, that a hypothetical scenario played out in Egypt in the 17th century. Now, imagine if the highly cultured Egyptians, with such beautiful art, such monumental architecture, with such ancient traditions, imagine if the Egyptians felt such complete awe and reverence for the invading Hyksos. The Hyksos are a complete bunch of barbarians whom the world has not seen before this. I mean, they were completely, we have no idea who they were before they invaded Egypt. Now, imagine if the Hyksos domination of Egypt was so complete and so utter that the Egyptians unsparingly, completely and scrupulously imbibed the Hyksos culture, language, and their gods, their rituals. Everything Hyksos was so completely absorbed by the Egyptians. Imagine such a scenario. What would be the consequences of such a scenario? And by complete, I mean exactly that, complete. Every living Egyptian man, woman, and child took the extraordinary effort to learn the Hyksos language. They took, in fact, every effort to wipe out all traces of the Egyptian language and culture. The name of every Egyptian man, woman, and child was changed to Hyksos. They took Hyksos names. Every child, every city, every river, animal, fruit was changed into the Hyksos tongue. Even things that we find only in Egypt, perhaps Egyptian flora and fauna, Egyptian phenomena, even such things which do not even have words in other languages, even they were turned into Hyksos words. Even perhaps the Hyksos swear words were adopted. So much so that 1 century after this invasion, there is not the slightest hint that the Egyptians ever spoke the Egyptian language. There is not a hint of the lost Egyptian language in the texts of the next generation. There is not a faintest hint that their ancestors 2 generations ago spoke Egyptian. Not even in the accents of the next generation. This hypothetical scenario doesn't stop with just this. There is not a single word or line or sentence or an image or a painting in memory of such a cataclysmic event that happened just 1 century ago. So there, what was Egypt once? For millenniums, the great civilization of Egypt completely subsumed, completely extirpated from all recorded and all recorded evidence and completely transformed into the language and culture of an invading tribe called the Hyksos. Now, doesn't all this seem impossible, ludicrous, extraordinary? Is this possible? Can such a complete transformation of one culture by another ever happen? Has it ever happened in history? Do we have even one such example? No. The answer is no. The answer to all these questions is no. Such a thing has not happened anywhere at any time, and yet, this is exactly the scenario that is proposed for North India in the 15th century BC by the so-called Aryan invasion or migration or osmosis theory, whatever they're going on with right now. To elaborate on what they're suggesting, this Hyksos scenario that they're suggesting for North, mind you, the population of the Harappans is much more than Egyptians. The extraordinariness of the Aryan migration theory has to be appreciated fully. This Hyksos scenario, which no sane man would ever agree could ever happen, forget Egypt, could ever happen anywhere, the scale of the same scenario having happened in North India is immense, is even more. Harappans were 5 million strong. It is estimated that they were almost 20% of the entire human population in around 2000 BCE. Now that is just Harappans. There were people living in the Gangetic Plains too. You add them into the mix, it could go up to more than 30%, definitely more than 30%. This Hyksos scenario of complete cultural transformation that is proposed for North India actually involves not just the Indus Valley, it also involves the Gangetic Plains. It's said to have happened all over North India. Now let's imagine this so-called Aryan invaders, these Aryan migrants coming down from southern Central Asia and invading into the Indus Valley. When they come through this heavily populated, this highly cultured and densely settled and agriculturalist Harappan lands, we expect a natural chain of events. When these pastoralists who are grazing their cattle, who are not familiar with the techniques of agriculture, who are not settled, who don't have great cities or great technology or a great intellectual baggage that they're coming here with, we expect a certain natural chain of events. We expect the invading Aryans to learn agriculture. If so, if they came to India, settled down and learned agriculture from the Harappans, we must ask, what are the Harappan agricultural terminology preserved in the Vedic texts? What are the names of the Harappan cereals, pulses, and agricultural implements preserved in the Rig Veda? Because anyone reading the Rig Veda will immediately notice that the Rig Vedic people are not just cow herders, are not just pastoralists. They are also agriculturalists. They are a settled, civilized lot. Again, these migrating Indo-Aryans would certainly have come across a lot of new animals and plants which are not found in Central Asia. So obviously, they're not going to name these new plants and animals in Sanskrit. They would have adopted the local names the Harappans had for these plants and animals. So what are the non-Sanskrit flora and fauna names preserved in the Rig Veda? There would certainly have been hundreds of names for cities and for the Harappan cities. Then what are the place and city names of the Harappans that are preserved in the Rig Veda? Are there any at all? We must ask. There would definitely be a lot of rivers. Up the Sindhu is the land of 7 rivers. They crossed a lot of rivers on their way from Central Asia up till the Gangetic Plains. What are the local names of these rivers as preserved in the Vedic text? Because if we look at world history, whenever an invading people took over the land from the locals, they tend to preserve the names of the rivers and places. For example, the colonialists preserved the names of the Mississippi and the Potomac rivers in Americas. The invading Indo-Europeans in Europe also preserved a lot of name elements of water bodies and rivers in Egypt, taken from old European languages which are no longer which are not recorded. If so, similarly, we expect the invading Aryans to have taken a lot of river names from North India. Next, did the invading Aryans, like the Hyksos, bring in any new animals or any new technology with them? Do we find any new technologies suddenly cropping up in our archaeological record in North India after the 15th century BCE? We don't. In fact, it is widely believed that it was the Central Asian Kurgans who invented the spoke wheel technology and chariotry. But counter to this widespread belief, we just discovered what could be the world's oldest chariot in Chanauli in Uttar Pradesh last year. So that adds to the mix of serious problems that this Aryan migration theory faces when proposing a Hyksos scenario for North India. Next, we know that the cow was the most important Indo-European animal. The cow was, in fact, it is more important than the horse actually. Yet, if it would not be wrong to assume that such a pastoralist people coming in from Central Asia would forget to bring their species of cows with them. It is known that the domestication of the cow happened in two places around the same time, around the 7th or the 6th millennium BCE. One of this happened in the Middle East, where the species Bos taurus was domesticated, while in India, in the Indus Valley, it was the Bos indicus, the Cebu cattle. The Taurus species was more spread into Europe. The Taurus species spread into Europe, while the Bos indicus species spread all over South India. So we would expect the invading Aryans to bring the Taurus species into South India, but that is not what happens. That is not what archaeology tells us. The archaeology tells us that the Indian species of cattle actually spread from South Asia into the Middle East, at least since the early 2nd millennium BC. Once again, archaeology throws a serious challenge to the Hyksos scenario proposed for North India. So, to conclude, we see that what the AMT and AIT scholars have proposed, all these, in fact, for a century, for North India, this Aryan migration, Aryan invasion theory is in fact equivalent to this hypothetical Hyksos scenario that we just imagined and described. And to all the questions we asked of what did these invading people bring with them, just like the hypothetical Hyksos, in fact the very real Hyksos people brought into Egypt, what did the invading Aryans bring into India? The answer to all those questions we asked is a big no. They took absolutely nothing from the Harappans. And the Harappans in turn took absolutely nothing from the Aryans. It's almost like these Indo-Aryans and the Harappans never even met. How is that possible? These Aryans are invading right through Harappan lands, and yet they seem to have never met. Forget a clash, forget a cultural diffusion. It looks like the preceding culture just magically vanished and a new one just snapped into existence, even as they were both temporally and geographically contemporary. So, by using this tool of an analogy, we find that the Aryan migration theory is equivalent to the Hyksos scenario, and in doing so, we have explained in easy terms just how extraordinary and how unacceptable it is to propose a migration theory of of an Indo-European language into India. It is not only extraordinary, it is also being pushed as fact. It has also been pushed as fact over decades, and these simple existential questions have never been bothered to be explained, and yet it still survives as a consensus opinion on Indian history, on how Sanskrit came to India. Using the Hyksos scenario, we are able to easily explain just how extraordinary the Aryan migration theory is. It is important because we have to make people who still subscribe to it understand why we oppose it. And we are not opposing it out of nationalist feeling, we are not opposing it out of religious feeling, we are not opposing it for any irrational or narrow reason. We are opposing it for genuine reasons rising out of our common sense. Because such a theory, the Hyksos scenario, goes against common sense. So the people who still promote the theory that a bunch of pastoralist Aryan invaders brought Sanskrit into North India and within a few centuries completely transformed the whole of North India into a new language. People who still subscribe to such a scenario have a huge burden of proof to explain how such a scenario can play out with absolutely not a shred of proof in support. We cannot allow these people to escape this burden of proof. That is our responsibility. We also have a responsibility to explain to the lay people who still subscribe to this why this theory is untenable and why such a thing could never have happened in South India, in South Asia. So I would like to conclude this talk saying that as this debate seems to be drawing to its close, we need to look at all the evidences gathered so far from our side and the huge lack of it on the opposite side, and we will certainly get a full clear picture from such an exercise. And I hope this Hyksos scenario will successfully give some clarity and a new perspective into this seemingly never-ending debate. Thank you.